Good afternoon, everyone. Before we start the session for today, let us chant Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavatu Arahatu Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavatu Arahatu Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavatu Arahatu Samma Sambuddhassa. All right. So today, because of course a change in time, understanding that some of our committed sort of members who are also working are unable to join, I have picked up a sutra which goes along the lines of the new practices that we have spoken about yesterday with Dhammanupassana, right? But it is, I have just shared the sutra with you. It is the Upaya Sutra, right? The Upaya Sutra. Now, it's fine if you do not have the printout. I'm sorry, my mistake. I've just put it out. So now let us look at the Upaya Sutra. Okay. Now, the Upaya Sutra, or the technique which is spoken of in the Upaya Sutra, is one which is quite important. Now, if we remember the session, I think Dr. Kamal Vitarana did it, where he did a wonderful explanation about Dhammanusati, right? About Dhammanusati. Now, Dhammanusati, when we look at Dhammanusati, what something that we do find is Dhammanusati goes into the contemplation of different variations of Dhamma or categorizations of Dhamma, right? Different variations or categorizations of Dhamma. One of those categorizations being the khandhas, right? So when it comes to the practice of Dhammanusati, altogether there are 5 main categories that we look at. 1, Nivarana Pabba. 2, Khandha or Skandha Pabba. 3, Ayatana Pabba. 4, Bojjanga Pabba. 5, Satcha Pabba. Something very important to note is when we think about our meditation and when we are trying to aim at a certain level where we are unable to reach a place of balance, what happens? We easily could doze off or become restless, right? Doze off or become restless. The reason for this, we explained, actually, I think we did discussed about it yesterday. It is difficult for the mind to balance. Because of the lack of balance, what happens is either restlessness appears, right? Or sloth and torpor. You start dozing off, difficult to balance, right? So we must, as we are discussing these different variations of Dhamma, which are quite deep in its insight, we must understand as practitioners that we must allow for organic growth. Now, in all cases of these categorizations, for example, yesterday, we sort of practiced on the Khandha Pabba, Skandha, right? what did we essentially look at? We looked at anapana, or rather Vedana, and we looked at the clinging that goes into that Vedana. Now, Vedana is a Khanda, am I right? Right? Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vinyana. Vedana is a Khanda. Vedana being a Khanda, it is a part of the Khanda Pabba. What did we look at? We looked at Tanha arising towards the Vedana, right? Tanha arising towards the Vedana. Today's sutra, the Upaya Sutra, looks at again the aggregates and how to pull ourselves away from the aggregates. That is what we are going to do today, right? Now, let me just share the screen with all of you. The Upaya Sutra, the discourse on engagement, originating in Savatthi. The Blessed One said this: disengaging with the aggregates, because the engaged is unliberated, the disengaged is liberated. The engaged is unliberated, the disengaged is liberated. Now, you know, the first sentence itself, now we are approaching the sutra today as a meditation guide, right? So not on a sutra basis, as a meditation, on a meditation basis, okay? So engaged is unliberated, disengaged is liberated. This is actually, I mean, a whole talk can be done on this sentence. Right? If we are to sort of break apart that sentence, that is so deep. Meaning, now, what is engaged? We are speaking about the aggregates. When the person, the practitioner, if we take, let's take Vedana, right? Because we understand Vedana to a fairly good extent. Vedana. Engaged with the Vedana. What is engaged with the Vedana? Engage with the Vedana. How do we usually engage with the Vedana? Mamatvein Vedanaava gannawa. Right? That is when the Vedana Khanda becomes a part of the 5 aggregates of clinging. Right? When a person takes the Vedana Khanda through the scope of this is me, this is mine, this is I, the mind is cornered to the perception of the Vedana. Right? That is, it's the Vedana itself is the limitation and hence the delimitation of the mind. It is the limitation and the delimitation of mind. The mind's, the boundary is set by that Vedana. Set by that Vedana. The disengaged is liberated. The practitioner who is not engaged with the Vedana through the scope of me, myself, and I is liberated. The mind approaching or seeing or experiencing that Vedana now has a sense of liberation. Why? Because of the lack of limitation or delimitation. Right? The corners of the mind is not regulated by the Vedana itself. Why? Because Tanha has not taken Vedana. Why? Because Tanha has not taken Vedana. Bhikkhus, consciousness, while active would be actively engaged with form, based on form, established on form, with a sprinkling of delight, it would come to grow and increase to being abundant. We know that the being is selfless, egoless, right? I mean, we know through the Dhamma, but we don't know, right? In terms of experience. The egoless, being egoless, one aspect is, for example, if a pot or a bowl is empty, being empty, it can be filled, isn't it? Right? The reality of the situation is such that there is no pot or bowl. However, we assume the existence of a pot or a bowl. Hence, we fill the pot or the bowl with whatever that we possibly can. This is done through the salayatanas and the contact. When that exists, bhikkhus, consciousness while active would be actively engaged with form. Based on form, consciousness, the mind takes or finds standing through self in form, establishes itself on form with a sprinkling of delight. The delight is again that a part of the dukkha khandha, we attach ourselves to fill that bowl, regardless of whether this thing is good or bad, the object or the form being good or bad. One thing, if anything, the mind is not used to is nothing. Do you understand? The mind is not used to nothing. ශූන්‍යතාවය කියන දෙය මනසට ගෝචර දෙයක් නෙමෙයි. ශූන්‍යතාවය දකින මොහොතකදී මනස කියන දෙය ඒ වෙලාවේ මනස කියන මේ ego, self sort of dwindles away. The mind cannot continue. So even in our meditation, with the upakleshas, what we see, the kleshas and the upakleshas, what we see, especially with the upakleshas, what we see is essentially the mind, the self, fighting against the clarity of vipassana. That is why the body starts struggling, mental and physical struggle starts to happen with the meditation object. The mind is not used to shunyata or nothingness. So we will at every point try to take an object which we can work with. That is what we try to realize in terms of disengaging from the aggregates. With a sprinkle of delight, it would come to grow, increase, and being abundant. That is what consciousness wants all the time. To grow, to increase, to being abundant. To do that, it will take whatever. It doesn't care. Right? It doesn't really care. It will take whatever object to fulfill the ego aspect. It is good if our environments are good and positive, it will sort of lead to some sort of positivity maybe. But if the environment is negative, then it's negative, right? Or consciousness, while active, would be actively engaged with feeling, first with rupa, vedana, based on feeling, established on feeling with a sprinkling of delight, it would come to grow, to increase, to being abundant. The multifaceted aspect of the aggregates feeds further life into the dimensions, the lifelike dimensions of the world that we live in. Form, feeling, perceptions, formations, and formations. Where is the other one? Because it's talking about the consciousness. Or consciousness, while active, would be actively engaged with perception, based on perception, established on perception. With a sprinkling of delight, it would come to grow, to increase, to being abundant. Or consciousness, while active, would be actively engaged with formations. Now, this part is the most difficult out of the rest, right? The most difficult out of the rest. So it is far more easier to see form, feeling, and perceptions in comparison to formations and consciousness. Why? Because formations and consciousness, even to a person who really does not understand the theory of it, who hasn't maybe done Abhidhamma, right? It's a bit confusing, isn't it? Right? I mean, what are the mental factors or the mental formations, and what is consciousness? To a person who hasn't studied it, right, gone into the Abhidhamma or whatnot, it is rather confusing. We assume that it is one of the same thing, right? Now we know that it is not, right? So think about it from a practitioner's perspective, being able to, or having the capacity to determine between what is consciousness and what are the mental factors. Yeah. What is consciousness and what are the mental factors? That is what makes that a challenge. Because, for example, feeling and perception are mental factors or mental formations, right? But we are dealing with one mental formation here. We are dealing with one other mental formation here. In formations, we are dealing with 50 mental formations, excluding feeling and perception, right? That is why the formations part of disengaging with the aggregates is quite challenging to a mind that is not calm and clear, right? To a mind which is not calm and clear. Because if someone were to say thus, apart from form, apart from feeling, apart from perceptions, apart from formations, I will make known the coming and going of consciousness, or its passing away and re-arising, or its growth, increase, and abundance. This is not possible. Now, that is a very important statement, everyone. Right? That is a very important statement. I'll read it again. Yes, Dhansiri?
Can you increase the size of the text?
I will. Yeah. Is that enough or more?
Find that.
Okay. Hard. Now, this is a very important statement, everyone. Right? Now, to recap, we've gone from form, feeling, perceptions, formations. Now, of course, where you might see where is the consciousness? The consciousness is the base, right? It is with the consciousness being the main figure here, right? That everything else dances together, right? So here the consciousness is present everywhere, in all parts. Now, 5, bhikkhus. If someone were to say thus, what? Apart from form, apart from feeling, apart from perception, apart from formations, I will make known the coming and going of consciousness, or its passing away and re-arising, or its growth, increase, and abundance. This is not possible. This is not possible. We already know that Chetasikas will arise with the consciousness will arise together with the Chetasikas, right? Sanya, and feeling, being Chetasika dharmas, will of course arise with the consciousness. Without sanya and perception, consciousness cannot arise. It will always arise together. So then the question falls, everyone, then the question falls, of course, what it is saying is, if someone says, I will show how consciousness arises and passes without the rest, that is an impossible task. That is an impossible task. However, the question then remains, how are we to see, or how can we differentiate between consciousness, what is the consciousness experience, and what is, or what are the other khandhas? Do you understand? Right? If perception, Vedana, for example, or Vedana and consciousness is present, what is Vedana? And if you are to sort of understand Vedana, then what is the understanding we have of consciousness? If perception is present, what is consciousness there in that same experience? Yeah. Moving on. Abandoning lust for the aggregates. Bhikkhus. If a monk's lust for the form element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis is cut off. There is no support for consciousness. There is no support for consciousness. Because if a monk's lust for feeling element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis is cut off. Now, in this part, we can imagine what is being said. Yeah. In this part, bhikkhus, if a monk's lust for the form element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis condition is cut off. The basis is cut off. There is no support for consciousness. Because if a monk's lust for feeling element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis is cut off. Right? The basis is cut off. There is no support for consciousness. Because if a monk's lust for perception element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis is cut off. There is no support for consciousness. Because If amongst lust for formation element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis is cut off. There is no support for consciousness. Bhikkhus, if amongst lust for consciousness element has been abandoned, with the abandoning of lust, the basis is cut off. There is no support for consciousness. Now, what does this mean? What does this mean? When it comes, or rather, how do we also do it? The lusting, we have to approach this in a manner which is organic. That is why, for example, if we take the Buddha's teachings in relation to our daily life, the Buddha speaks about Paccavekkhana, isn't it? Reflection, Paccavekkhana. Now, Paccavekkhana covers ahara, besajja, right? Clothing and shelter, right? Food, shelter, clothing, and food, shelter, clothing, and besajja, medicines, right? Now, if we are to take the things that we sort of adorn ourselves with, or sort of, have in our lives, these are the main four things, right? These are the four main basic necessities of a being. But the world is such that, for example, back in the day, um, monks would eat to survive. People don't eat to survive anymore, right? That is the reality of life. We do not eat to survive anymore because food is not scarce. We are not hunter-gatherers anymore. We go to the supermarket, buy whatever we want, or Uber Eats, or whatever it is. Food is not scarce. However, what that teaching, or how that teaching applies to our lives now, is these basic necessities might be that which we work to hold and to maintain our lives with. With the Paccavekkhana, what happens is we are able to now maintain our life without the attachment, or rather without getting carried away with those things, which is an important aspect of abandoning lust for the aggregates. මම මොනවටද මේ දේවල් පරිශීලනය කරන්නේ? Right? Why am I doing it? That is important. So much so that if a bhikkhu does not remind, there are two ways, there are two methods, which there is a Vinaya rule actually, and the Vinaya rule has two parts. If a bhikkhu does not do Paccavekkhana through the day or whilst consuming, you can do it through the day, or rather at the end of the beginning of the day, or you can do it whilst consuming. These are the two. If you don't do both, you entail an offense. Why? It is a contemplation, right? It is a contemplation. Why? Because without that, you lose track of why you are consuming. And that is again an important aspect and part of the abandoning of lust for the aggregates. The mentality through which we consume from the beginning, from the start, right? From the beginning, from the start. On a meditation level, at the position of meditation, once you have done that, and once you have that in order, your contemplation in order through your daily life, on a meditation aspect, the mind has an inclination of surviving or tiptoeing in dependence of the rising of Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara. tiptoeing on or in dependence of the arising of Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara. Example. Now we do guided meditation practice together, right? I am speaking, guiding, and you are listening, right? And sort of following along the practice. There are positions I imagine where now we have a specific sort of, I mean, the way that I start or whatnot, you would have an inclination, this is the pace that I speak, or the meditation is guided, isn't it? And there are moments where the pace might be broken, or, where I go silent for a bit more time than you would expect me to go silent for, right? The mind then, in meditation, there's far more to contemplate. The mind is now question mark. Ko Bhante. That is the lusting, right? That is the lusting. But it arises, now there is to contemplate. If anapana is being observed, the breath is there and that should be contemplated, right? However, it arises now as a vanchaka dhamma. Vanchaka dharmayak haraha thamai then ara trushnava hatagane. A trushnava not because my voice is the be all and end all, for the object. The mind needs the object. The object is comforting to the mind. That is why obviously guided meditations are far more easier to do in comparison to silent alone meditation, right? But when you sort of get into the groove of silent and meditating alone, it is a little bit challenging to get back into group guided meditation. Sorry, right? Why? Because the mind lusts for that form, Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara. That lust. Now knowing and identifying that this lust has now appeared and arisen, we now come back and settle and say, no, I have things to do. What is to be done? Vedana, Vedananupassanavam nam Vedanava බලන එක, ආනාපාන සතිය නම් ආනාපාන breathing බලන එක, චිත්තානුපස්සනාව නම් චිත්තය බලාගෙන ඉඳීම. There is something to be done. The moment that lust for that object appears, even, for example, Vedananupassana, ko-Vedana, you get that? That's the lust. Everyone is like smiling, so everyone. Right? So that is then the lusting. When that lust appears, that's a sankhara dharma. That itself is a formation that we then get rid of or abandon. When that is abandoned, the mind is able to maintain itself in a position of calm and tranquility. Right? A trushnava natiguna mote, you experience samadhi. Just go back. When you didn't want anything, when you don't want anything, you come into a position of silence. You come into a position of content. You're happy where you are. And it's not even happy in the sense of overjoyed or joy. You're simply there, right? And it's pleasant, but you do not acknowledge the pleasance of it. But it just feels right, isn't it? Because it would be wrong of us to also sort of classify it as pleasant, because we are not there because it's pleasant. It just somehow, it's right. That's the position to be in. What happened there? The need, the want, rather, disappeared. Right? ඒකෙත් පොඩි වෙලාවක් ඉඳලා ආපහු, what am I to do now? They are the tanha again. That's the lust again. That lust is impermanent, is conducive to suffering, right? Now, when you ask the question, what am I to do now? If I am not going to tell you, for example, if it is guided and I'm not going to guide you anymore, right? And you don't know what to do, now what happens? The anxiety comes. What am I to do? What am I to do? Right? Now, what did that do? Now that's suffering. That's the suffering aspect where it destabilizes you. There was nothing wrong where you were, and you have nothing more to do if you get up also. But the suffering now destabilizes you. And then the anatma fact is this twisting and turning. You turn into anything. Right? One moment you're calm and tranquil. The other moment you're questioning. The other moment you are anxious. The other moment you're pleasant. Now you see it is like a shapeshifter. Asara, asara kattena. Asara, asara, meaning, I don't know how to pronounce it properly. I'm sorry. It is anatma because of asara kattena, meaning asara u hetuin anatmai. Asarai කියන්නේ මොකද්ද? කිසිම no essence. No essence. So, for example, this sort of now for here, if you see, we have, it's almost as if consciousness, whilst being active, would actively engage with perception. It is almost as if consciousness is the kind of base and it engages with something, isn't it? Right? But of course, we know enough to say it's not so, right? It's not like that. But it is almost as if consciousness is engaging with this object or this element of perception. Asara means, in anatma, asara means this is impermanent. This does not last. It changes. It changes in terms of what object it takes and all of that. And this too changes. This too changes. Consciousness too changes. So asara means no essence anywhere. Because it doesn't truly have a base, original face. Wholly dependent upon the object that it takes, it changes. Yeah, it changes. The ego holding on to the continuous stream of habitual object, the continuous stream of habitual object. What is a habitual object? A habitual object is an object that you have clung on to through ego, which is now identifiable with the personality. Right? For example, if you are a person who likes coffee, for example, right? And you drink a lot of coffee, you have an expensive or a certain brand of coffee that you have come to like. Anything other than that brand or that price range or that flavor is now not agreeable to you. Now you think that this is self, but this is the delusion of self built upon attachment to a habitual object. When the lusting for that perception feeling disappears, now you can drink any coffee. That is the lust that is spoken of here. Consciousness is unestablished. When that consciousness is unestablished, not growing, not generating, now you're not feeding fire, you're not feeding hay into the fire anymore. It is liberated. When you are not the rope by which you pull The rope is missing. It's not there. On account of being liberated, it is steady. On account of being steady, it is contented. On account of being contented, it is not agitated. On account of being unagitated, he himself attains nirvana. Now let us look closely at this. This is the end of the sutra, right? When that consciousness is unestablished, not growing, not generative, it is liberated, right? Now that is a position to come into where you do not further feed the consciousness. Yeah, you're simply being, not doing. Doing in the sense karma. Doing is karma. Karma is more sankhara. More sankhara means heavy. When the karma where you're accumulating sankhara is not happening, right? Now you are in a position of observation and you're not sort of clinging and attaching again and again. On account of being, that is a liberated mind where you can simply observe and not be engaged. Meaning not having that lust. On account of being liberated, it is steady. We have experienced this to a certain extent. It is steady. On account, but the thing is, the steadiness does not please us fully yet, right? The steadiness does not please us fully as yet, because why? We, in a way, still inclined to the busyness. What? The vitarka aspects. Yeah. So on account of being steady, it is content. Because of the lack of content. Now, when we are in that position of samadhi, okay, we are there. But that when the contentment is not there, what happens is a break happens. We come out of the samadhi and we start questioning contentment, right? That comes through, of course, balance. On account of being contented, it is not agitated. What is agitation? Vitakka vichara. That agitation does not arise. That agitation which disturbs. But what when there is no agitation, what arises is insight, tava. We go deeper and deeper into the nama rupa, all the jnanas. On account of being unagitated, he himself attains nirvana. He himself attains nirvana, right? Destroyed his birth, the holy life has been lived, done what needs to be done. There is no more of this state of being. Now that is a sutra, right? That is a sutra, right? Which I think sort of elucidates upon some very important aspects and parts. But still we have questions. I hope so. Right? Now, when we look at the aggregates, what we need is a sense of direction on the part of how do I arrive at a position of not dissolution, disenchantment from the skandhas, right? Within our practice of meditation, which is found in the Patisambhida Magga and the Vishuddha Magga, mind you, it is explained of 40 ways in which a disciple attains adaptable balance with regards to the way he contemplates the 5 aggregates. 40 ways. 40 ways. I will read out the list. I don't have it on digital. The first, now this is with regard to the 5 aggregates, right? Impermanent, anicca, suffering, dukkha, disease, roga, boil, gandha, arrow, salla, evil, aga, sickness, abada, alien, para, crumbling, paloka, calamity, iti, danger, upaddava, fear, baya, misfortune, upasagga, unstable, chala, disintegrating, pagangu, inconstant, adduva, without protection, athana, without shelter, alena, without refuge, asarana, null, ritta, vain, tucha, empty, sunya, without self, anatta, dangerous, adinava, mutable, viparinama dhamma, without essence, asara, root of eagle, agamula, murderous, vadaka, unprosperous, vibhava, with pains, sasava, compounded, sankata, prey of mara, maramisa, subject to birth, jati dhamma, subject to decay, jara dhamma, subject to ailment, vyadi dhamma, subject to death, marana dhamma, subject to sorrow, soka dhamma, subject to grief, parideva dhamma, subject to despair, upayasa dhamma, subject to corruption, sankilesa dhamma. Those 40. Now, we, of course, we know the 3. Impermanent, suffering, non-self. Right? Impermanent, suffering, non-self. I'll take a photo of this and I'll post it on the group for all of you as well. Okay. Now, what does this sort of look at? This looks at, now with different people, different aspects appear to be more resonant, to sort of kick their own sort of personal favorations or personal tendencies, isn't it? Some people might not mind death, but they do mind aging, for example, right? Some people don't mind aging, but they mind death, right? In so many ways, I mean, we are complex. We find through these 40 ways, what the practice is talking about are the 40 ways by which we can definitely come into a conclusion of the frailty of the weaknesses existence within the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates. For example, if we are to take the fact of, let's say, dangerous, adinava. Dangerous, adinava. Now, danger, what is danger? Danger can apply to every situation of life. For example, even the fact you want to commit yourself to something, but then the fear arises, my God, that thing that you want to commit yourself to is in danger. Because why? The mind changes. This complex changes. The object the complex takes is changes. So now what you want to commit yourself towards also changes with time. So then With that arises the fact of fear, bhaya. What will I do then? What will I do if I'm not happy with this? This constant instability. What is that? Chala. In every way, if you, you look at it when I send the picture over, you will find that every aspect that you experience in terms of anything that makes you feel that you're not where you want to be, you will find that in this list. Right? You will find that on this list, coming from the fact of this is if the 5 aggregates or clinging to 5 aggregates leads to some sort of suffering, that suffering is labeled here with. Why? Because not because that suffering is induced, but because of the nature of the 5 aggregates. That nature, when we are sort of contemplating through the sight of vipassana, what we then enable ourselves to sort of truly sort of open our minds towards is the fact of this is the reality of this Dhamma that I'm so rooted into, that I am so rooted into. That is then in those ways, as we take anicca, dukkha, anatma, to further solidify the disenchantment towards the 5 aggregates, we can use any of those 40. Or even more, meaning one or more than one, right? Any part of those 40 we can use, right? Even if, for example, as and when we are contemplating on the 5 aggregates, or we are visibly looking at the 5 aggregates, even with regards to anapanasati or vedanānupassana or chittanupassana, any one of the satipatthanas we can connect to the 5 aggregates. We know that already. Those 5 aggregates can also be connected to the 4 noble truths, the Eightfold Noble Path. Right? If we take the 5 aggregates in terms of chittas and chetasikas, we can connect them into the Eightfold Noble Path and any part of even the Patthana. Isn't it? Even the Patthana or the Paticcasamuppada. So we can connect all of these things together. In doing so, at that moment of sitting in meditation with anapana or any other type of satipatthana practice, the seeing of the aggregates or observing the aggregates can be done, of course, if it's vipassana, we do it in impermanent suffering non-self. But danger, adina, and upaya, fear, all of these things can be taken to suit any one of, again, impermanent suffering non-self. All can be, those 40 that we've just spoken of can be taken to further strengthen the understanding of impermanent suffering non-self. Right? Impermanent suffering non-self. When, for example, some sort of fear, now the uncertainty, what am I to do now? In your meditation, when that question arises, that sense of instability can also be put into part of the khandhas, the nature of the khandhas there. Yeah, the fear, oh my gosh, what will happen? For example, when your Vedananupassana or your limbs are hurting, they're burning with pain, you can put that into fear again. And when that fear, the nature is of the 5 aggregates impermanent. It is impermanent. That fear is impermanent. That bhaya is impermanent. That adinam is impermanent. They change too. All of that can again be connected. Right? But of course, the more factors that you introduce in sort of visibly contemplating, the busier the mind is going to be. So it is not advisable that you have a whole barrage of words in your mind as well. right? What we should or be able to do is this. When it arises, being aware enough to realize what has arisen. That moment to moment awareness, we are not going into meditation with a whole sort of bag of dhammas that we sort of pick from and label. ඒ මොහොතේ හටගන්න ඒ ධර්මයේ ඒ මොහොතේම විශ්ලේෂණය කරලා ඉවර කරනවා. That is it. Right? Now that you know, okay, if fear arises, that fear can be linked to this. Right? That is an aspect. ස්කන්ධයක් තියෙන තාක්කල්, ස්කන්ධයත් එක්ක ජීවත් වෙන තාක්කල් මේ බය කියන දේ හට ගන්නවා. එතකොට දැන් ඒ බය පදනම් කරා ගන්නවා ස්කන්ධ විරාගයට. ඒ බය දැන් ස්කන්ධ විරාගයට උපකාර වෙලා. අනිච්චතාවය, the changing nature. The moment that everything changes, now you use impermanence, or the moment that you realize this constant changing, for example, you realize there is a strong sensation. The strong sensation, when you go into samadhi or at a certain point, it disappears. Impermanence. Now, what I thought might be permanent is it's not permanent, right? Again, skandha virage, right? Think about, for example, the paramis. Now, they say paramis need to be determined. Meaning, if you are doing something which is good, right, that thing that is good need to be sort of determined towards enlightenment, so that the force of good now aids in liberation or the freeing from sankhara, rather than the further accumulation of sankharas to facilitate a comfortable life. Do you understand? Right? Meaning, if we do something good, we know something comfortable will come out of it through the law of karma. Are we chasing comforts or are we chasing nirvana? That is where, when something good or wholesome is done, we would determine it to aid and support nirvana. The more that this is done, what happens is, in your mind, a sense of anusati develops. මේ හොඳ අරමුණ තව තව වැඩ කරන්න තව තව නිවන් මාර්ගයට තියෙන කැපවීම තව වැඩි වෙනවා. Just like, for example, with the shelter, the food, the besajja, and the clothing. When we sort of, if we are completely devoted towards the practice, it is in the spirit of that devotion towards the practice that we would also sort of feed ourselves, eat, and do all of that as well. So then, now that sort of excessive tanha to sort of have and to sort of accumulate now reduces. Do you see the connection there? Right? Now, this is not to say that you have to wear the same thing to every event. No. Right? But this is to say that that we do not get carried away in spirit of tanha, but do what we must. It is in line and in tune with keeping ourselves in check, that then later helps in the disenchantment from the skandhas. Is that clear, everyone? That is the Upaya Sutta. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Hemali.
Bhante, today when I do meditation, um, I notice that it's very subtle in breath and out breath, and what you said now is same time I notice the present moment that I am observing. I am at the present moment, and the other thing, Bhante, the heartbeat I noticed. So I was thinking at that time which one I have to concentrate, and I remember I want to ask this question at that time.
So you were starting with
This
Anapanasati.
Anapanasati, yes.
Yeah. So Anapanasati, it's continuously with the breath.
So I have to with the subtle breath. Yes, I notice subtle breath. So I have to concentrate on subtle breath. Observe the subtle breath. Is that the thing you say?
Well,
The,
you don't have to.
no, I mean to observe.
Yes.
So, yeah.
So at that moment, if the breath is subtle,
Yeah.
well, for the sake of moment awareness, we might recognize the breath to be subtle. However, we do not classify it as subtle in general, because then we corner ourselves to the subtle breath. For example, the long breath and the short breath.
Yeah.
Just like the subtle breath and the gross breath.
Yeah.
It is a breath. For in earlier stages, we classify it as subtle breath, gross breath, or long breath, short breath, or the counted breath, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10, right? We do that for the sake of heightening awareness over the breath. As we progress, or when we can fully see the breath, then මෙතන subtle කියලා නම් කරන්න අවශ්‍ය නැහැ.
Very.
Yes, so then the breath, වායු ධාතුව, the breath, that is it, right? That is it. Whether it is subtle, whether it is gross, okay, it might be subtle, it might be gross, but you do not necessarily need to look at that aspect of the breath. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? The breath, so you're observing or continuing to observe the breath, and the breath might, in your case, disappear and reappear, right? And that you keep on sort of being with that specific Vayu Dhatu. Yeah.
Okay.
Because again, not to corner ourselves to a specific thing, but to simply have the ability to observe open-minded. Yeah. 3-8. Anyone else? Yes, Shriyani.
Bhante, when we did the meditation yesterday with the Aloka Sanya,
Yeah.
now I struggled with Aloka Sanya to visualize that light. But instead of that, I had a pounding in the chest, and the pounding became more and more, and it started going through the whole body, the pounding, rather than the Aloka Sanya. I think probably this visualization is a bit of a struggle for me. And then when you mention that the whole body is bathed with Buddha Chitta, then it's changed into something bit different. It's like a Chenresi meditation. Found it the Chenresi technique and going through the whole body, that feeling.
Yeah.
And then when you say it, just let that go through the head out, but it became like big black, I don't know what it is, something, it was just going through out the head, something like that. It was like a sign of blackness. What was that? Why was that experience?
Well, it could be that you're not very imaginative, or visual rather, not imaginative, visual. And I think we spoke about this earlier as well, isn't it? Where the visual.
Yes, we have. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So maybe that is so. And this specific technique, which was the Aloka Sanya, it is not the very traditional Aloka Sanya. Right, it is not the traditional Aloka Sanya, but it is actually a mix and match between a Tibetan technique.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
But this technique, for some, because of the aloka, the essence of light, it makes a person feel lighter. But if for example, you are unable to sort of essentially see that part, or to sort of visualize that part, that's quite all right, Shreya. Right? That's quite all right. You don't have to be really, just continue along with the meditation that you've already been doing.
Okay,
because some people, they are not so good at visualizing. The visual, they are not strong in that, but their other sensors are strong.
Yes, the feeling is more stronger in me, I think,
Yeah.
the feeling, how I, Danima, Danima is much more powerful in me, I think, yeah.
Okay. All right, Sharon. Sujata, you wanted to?
Question, what is Vanchaka Dharma?
Vanchaka Dhamma are masquerading factors.
Masquerading when you say?
So Renukani Chandabimala Swami Maharaj's definition of Vanchaka Dharma is Pararthakami Veshin Artmarthakami Kriyava.
In other words?
In other words, Pararthakami Veshin. It looks as if, or it seems as if, Pararthakami. Para means you're thinking about others or the welfare of another and doing it. Pararthakami Veshayin Artmarthakami Kriyava. Meaning, it seems as if you're thinking about another person, but what you're essentially trying to fulfill is not the well-being or the wellness of another person, but it is your own agenda. Artmarthakami Kriyava. Yeah.
Does it be a selfish kriya? Is it, Bhante? Like being your own selfish
motives.
Correct.
Yes.
Does it only
also can be cheating yourself, isn't it?
It is
cheating yourself.
It is cheating yourself.
Yes.
Masquerading factors and being cunning is two different things. Here in masquerade, even you do not realize, if you are not aware of it, you do not realize that you're doing it.
Sometimes in the meditation, you can fool yourself thinking you are attending certain level, isn't it?
Yes.
And you're not, whereas you're not, unless you have a good teacher who guides you.
Yeah.
A discussion with a, yeah.
Very much. And of course, for example, with metta, with sort of meditations that focus on others, or sort of giving, now things like that could very easily become Vanchaka dharmas as well. No?
Yes, deceiving yourself. In other words.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes. Think I get it. Thank you, Bhante.
Vanchaka dharmas.
Yes. Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah. Yes. All right, everyone. So if that's all the questions, then we will call today's
Call it a day.
Namsiri, yes?
No, we have got a problem. No. Okay. Mm.
Okay.
Okay, now, no, it's not.
It's
Okay.
Mala.
Yeah, it's interfering with the Mala's microphone, even though we switched off. It's not properly switched off. Bhante, I like to ask that yesterday's talk, very interesting point, the Paticcasamuppada.
Okay.
And in that, you explain that from Vedana to Tanha, right? The underlying driving force is dukkha,
Okay.
right? So actually, not only the Vedana to Tanha, but the whole cycle of Patisampada, the underlying factor is the dukkha,
Yes.
suffering, right? And so that's something new I have heard actually. So it's probably in one of these discussions. Can you elaborate now? When it comes to Vedana, now of course you have Sukha Vedana and Dukkha Vedana and neutral Vedana, right? And so how can it actually, the intensity of moving that stage to the Trishna and then multiplying that into Upadana, so how the relationship actually govern, how far the dukkha should be in action, in strength to move forward. That sort of explanation, right? Because I understood as a driving force for the whole cycle of Paticcasamuppada is underneath the concept of dukkha, right? That's what you explain, yeah?
Yeah. So with the Paticcasamuppada, we have in the middle, if we sort of remember Mogoxiado's sort of chart, we have, let me get the chart up, maybe it won't be. We have Avidya and Avidya and Sampada. Yeah. Here we go. Right. Now, this is Venerable Mogoxiado's chart. The main causes for the cycle, or rather, who, if we are to take it as a wheel, what turns this chariot wheel? Like the Dhamma Chakra Pavattana, right? What turns this chariot wheel? By what foundation or what inclinations does this wheel exist? Mainly on the push an energy of avidya and tanha. Because of avidya and tanha. Tanha operates on the grounds of dukkha. Tanha operates on the ground of dukkha. Hence, because of because of avidya and tanha, this cycle happens. This cycle takes place. Right? This cycle takes place. Ignorance is there and tanha is elsewhere. Right? However, the driving force which keeps where the contentness does not exist is because of the avidya and the tanha. The tanha is dukkha. That is how then that turns. Mogada tanhava thula yam kisi, what's the word for content? If there is some sort of content in tanha, tanha would not be tanha. Right? The fact of dukkha governs that tanha as well. So now, when we sort of then take anicca, dukkha, anatma. When we take anicca, dukkha, anatma, like consciousness, karma, and anusaya, right? Consciousness, karma, and anusaya, likewise, anicca, dukkha, anatma have a mutually supportive relationship. When it comes to all phenomenon, there is, for example, if you take dukkha, dukkha tulat anityatave pavatina. Anityatave tula dukkha pavatina. Anatmaya tula anityatave saha dukkha bhave kine me dekat pavatina. So in all aspects, impermanent, suffering, and non-self, it is because of these three aspects being there that its operation works out. That is why it is through only awareness that we are able to come through, because we finally see how that dukkha, impermanence, and non-self allows us to step out of that cycle. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah. That is why I think that Mogoksyado's sort of chart is so impressive.
Bhante, can you send us the link for that one?
Just Google Paticcasamuppada.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or dependent origination, then it will come up.
Dependent, okay, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Okay, so then if that is all the questions that we have, thank you so much for joining in for this session. Tomorrow's meditation will be happening in the morning. I will see you all hopefully then. Take care and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Teruvan Saranai.
Teruvan Saranai, Bhante.
Teruvan Saranai, Bhante. Good evening.
Good evening.